So welcome
Thank you.
to this day when we're not doing a whole lot here at Temple Emanuel. We're just sort of hanging
Quiet
out.
day here.
It's pretty laid back.
Yeah.
So welcome. You are the editor of the Denver Post, but tell us a little bit about yourself, about your journey, how you got to where you are now.
All right. Yes. So I grew up not too far from here in southeast Denver and went to Thomas Jefferson. Then
Well, give her a chance to people applaud.
Yeah.
Okay.
and I left for college. I decided when I was a senior in high school, I was watching TV and I was watching, I don't even remember what, but anchor, a news person giving a report from somewhere. And I thought, what I really thought is that person knows everything before everybody else. And so I want to know everything before everybody else
You're
too.
one of
That
those, huh?
it wasn't as high-minded as I want to tell the truth to the world. And so I went off to college to Drake University in Des Moines. And and I got my journalism degree there, and then worked at a few papers along the way. I went headed to Appalachia in Tennessee for my first job, and from there to South Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina, where I got married 30 years ago. Just had our 30th anniversary.
Mazel tov.
And then back to Des Moines, to the Des Moines Register, and then in 1999 I came back to Denver and got a job at the Denver Post, and went through a series of different editing jobs there, just kind of moving up the chain of command. City editor, handled our investigative team for a while, was second in command for a while, and then became editor in 2016.
Wonderful. So, this is a softball question.
Okay, good.
They're all softball questions, don't worry. We're talking about truth, and as I said in my sermon last night, a couple weeks ago, we talked about spiritual truth, and now we want to talk about the role of truth in the public sphere. So before we get to that, tell me, how has the newspaper business changed over the course of your career? How much time do we have?
Yeah, right. I mean, for clarity, I learned I was using a typewriter in college, so there's that change.
Me too.
But fundamentally, even by the time I got to Denver, the internet wasn't really a part of our operation. Like, we still depended on the print paper, and maybe sometime in the night, I worked the night shift for a while, somebody come down from online, they were on a different floor, and we'd tell them 2 or 3 stories they could put online, and never really thought that much more about it. And of course, with that, meant that we only published once a day. It also meant that we, the people in the room, at the newspaper, would just sit in a little room, a few editors, and decide what the big story was of the day. And that's how we would decide what would get played up, and if it was interesting to us, that's what we would cover. And that's been one of the big changes around the internet, is you know what people are interested in. You also know what should be important, and you spend a lot more time trying to figure out how to meld those two together so that you don't write. Obviously, we don't want to just write about silly things. But we also know that so many important things you've got to think through a lot more carefully about how to present them, how to write them, when to publish them, so that people will eat their spinach too.
Sure, I like spinach. It's interesting you say that, because at the beginning of your career, you sat around a table and you decided, and now you're...
Well, actually, it was all men, but now, if I'd been there, though. Yeah,
I believe that, and I'm very glad you are where you are. We need that desperately in our society.
Sorry.
No, it's good. So, but now it seems like the internet is becoming the arbiter or the driving force. Do you find that you're playing catch up with what other people are thinking is important?
There are times when that occurs, and sometimes they're right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes people have identified something, and you look at it and you go, "Goodness, we haven't really covered that enough." I might argue that we were slow to homelessness as an issue inside inside the city as one example. Particularly as some of the encampments and stuff were taking off, we were working from home. We didn't necessarily see it with our own eyes, and so we got a little bit behind. But also, an advantage to be in the Denver Post is you do get to stake your flag in now and then and say, you know, this publication or that might be chasing after this story, but that's not who we are. That's not core to our mission, and so we're not going to do that. Also, the dawn of digital subscriptions has mattered a lot in how we can think about what news we cover and what we don't. Reason being that when everything was free, you know, you could be kind of driven by, oh, they're reading this, they're reading that, we need to do, you know, you could really fall into that. With digital subscriptions, we are able to see what a person is reading on when they go and get their credit card and subscribe. And that's very different than just the kind of stuff they might randomly click on. And so there you do see that people are reading serious political stories, stories about homelessness. Injustice is a really big area for us. And Broncos.
Of course. Of course. So our theme for the High Holy Days is truth. And personally and then professionally, what does truth mean to you? Because we have so many different definitions flying out there.
Oh, yeah, that's the softball question.
That's the
right.
softball question, yeah.
It's complicated in journalism, and it's evolving in journalism, and it's evolving in my own mind, and it's evolving with the new people who are entering the industry. When I was coming up, first of all, whatever your own thinking was about what was true, the idea was that didn't matter. Like you put that, you bury that, you get that down, and you, in many ways, in a healthful way, open your mind to more new ideas, right? And that's healthy because one of the problems we see now is where people get so sure of what they believe to be true that they don't open their minds to other ideas. And so this forced you to listen to everybody and come back and try to retell what you had learned through the day in your days as a reporter, report it, if you will, as the term comes from, and bring all these ideas in.
Sure.
And it's still a core part of what we do. But with time and with feedback, to the point about not every fact, a fact isn't always true in and of itself without context, and there's a saying that journalism without judgment isn't journalism, and so you begin to try to bring in and understand more broadly what the real bigger story is, if you will, the underlying currents, the underlying truths, and bring those up. And with that comes, in many people's desire, is to be able to express themselves more in the stories that they're telling, or in the way they live their lives. You know, we would traditionally say, and this came up a lot in some of the early women's marches around the beginning of the Trump administration, and I never had so many volunteers to work a march in my life as that was, because we would not permit people to participate, and they would say, but for me, this is who I am, this is core to who I am, and my role as a journalist shouldn't preclude me from attending a pride or a march of whatever it might be, or a demonstration, because that matters to me. So that's sort of I don't know if that gets at it, but that's sort of an evolving area of it.
Sure. So how does media, and I'm using the word media, even though you're in the newspaper business, at this point you're in the newspaper. I mean, our family is one of the few families that still gets the Post delivered because we like to do the crossword puzzles. I think that's basically...
Fair enough. Same.
But we also get it online. We get it in the morning. We get it in the afternoon. I mean, you really are covering everything. But how does media help promote truth, and how does it hurt truth?
It can promote it. It can promote it by what it highlights as important, and by pointing out where the public discourse has gone off the rails, and to try to just keep bringing it back again and again. I'm brought to mind of a woman I know who runs the New York Times News Service. And when she was younger, she ran the New York Times International Desk. And she was telling me this story about how every day she was wanting to put stories up. She kept pitching stories about the Sudan. And her bosses would be like, Sudan again? Really? Do we have to do Sudan again? And she's like, yes, we are going to keep writing about the Sudan until people understand and are willing to open up and understand what's going on there. And to that end, media can play such an important role in highlighting those sorts of things. Media, though, is a huge institution, a part of the power of a community, and with that, when it gets it wrong, it can do horrible damage. I mean, I don't know of here of people in the world would know that can happen. That the media can pick up a very false story and tell it and amplify it in a way that is nothing short of destructive. And that's where, and that's really in some ways where having more, that's an upside to the internet, if you will, because you do get more instant feedback from people who are like, you just got that wrong. And if you're not too arrogant to listen, you can say, well, I guess we did, and let's try to rethink how we're approaching this.
You know, the idea of a free press is central to what I believe, and I think most of us grew up understanding. But we are seeing increasingly that different press organizations have specific biases. Is that a new trend, or has it always been that way? We just haven't seen it as much. I mean, when I grew up, we listened to Walter Cronkite, or we read the New York Times, and that was we believed it because it came from God, basically. Right. But now you can live in a bubble and hear whatever perception you want.
Well, you're not old enough to have known the way back, right? Media, newspapers at least, as the oldest form, I suppose, it has evolved over time. Sure. They have gone from the early days, colonial times, if you will, want to just start there.
I was not there.
Right. And where they were, everybody, they all had opinions, right? And that's just what they built about. And some papers to this day carry names left over from that, Democratic Gazette, whatever it might be. And so you had these very biased viewpoints, and everybody just understood that's what it was. It was told from a point of view. That only really began changing when the business model changed, and advertisers came in. And advertisers didn't really want to put their name or their mattress or refrigerator or whatever in front of and be making half the people mad. So it was really to kind of grow that part of the business that tone began to change, and you moved your opinion over to an editorial page and placed it more soundly there.
It's fascinating because you think that advertising or commercialism would drive you in one direction, but you're saying it drove us in the other direction. It moved away from being a bias and more towards being more universal, so you can sell more papers. You can sell more papers. That's amazing. Thank you. I didn't know that. That's remarkable. By the way, Steve Stark is walking around with cards and golf pencils, and if you have a question, feel free to write it down, and we will try and get it answered here. Given this is a tough one for you. Sorry, but given the plethora of national and international free news sources available today, how can you keep local newspapers relevant?
People will complain to us that a Denver Post subscription, for example, costs more, or at least as much as a New York Times subscription. They go, we could get so much, the whole world, with the New York Times. And But we do know that people, our readers, care about their local community. It's where they live, and they're raising their children, and it's their schools and their tax money and what they see every day. I think most local media have doubled down on that.
Focusing on the...
brought their focus closer and closer to home. And certainly we see that our readers, I mean, we'll put national news, but it's not particularly well read there. People do go to other sources for that. That's fine. That's not my expertise, certainly. And so we just bring our attention and drive home that for you to live in a state that is the kind of state or city or community you want, being informed about that community is critical. And that's where we find our spot. And it's where we're finding our success also. And you see it even smaller, the little papers, like the little papers that serve Cherry Creek or Washington Park or Douglas County, or that are real hyper local, have enjoyed some immunity from the problems that have faced more regional papers like ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Wow. One of the criticisms that we see of some news outlets is that they exist in a bubble, telling people just what they want to hear. Again, this gets back to the idea of what is truth, or creating outrage or fear or anger that will cause them to want to continue engaging with a news source. Do you think that's true?
Well, I don't like to call them news organizations. I like to call them propaganda organizations.
Okay, good. I do too.
And I mean, they certainly exist. We can't kid ourselves. We can't and we shouldn't kid ourselves about their existence. We know they're there, and some of them do disguise themselves as news organizations. And that's why for most of what I'll just call the mainstream media, the more traditional media, we've tried to double down on differentiating ourselves in ways small and large, and try to say, what makes us different is this or that or the other, including being clear about where our money comes from. We, in the last year at the Post, began making sure that the biographies of our writers were right there, were easy to find. So if people think like, why does this person seem to have this, or what does this person really know about this or that, they can go look up and see kind of what that person's history and training is. And so that you can come to form an opinion about the news source that you're using, and hopefully recognize the difference between that and the bubble news sources. And it's not hard to tell if you've stumbled into one of those, right?
Sure.
They do use loaded language throughout. When you're reading them online, they often don't have links to other kinds of news organizations in there that you can follow. They don't have a full-throated voice from both sides. You can't find it in any kind of story. So there are tells that people can use, but it does fall a lot on the consumer to be aware of what they're looking at.
And that's hard, because then you have to assume that there's an educated populace that you're bringing to, but not everybody has that either sophistication or desire. They just want to hear what they want to hear, read what they want to hear, and know how the Broncos are doing, of course.
And we know how the Broncos. Yeah. That's true, and it's a scary battle.
Sure.
That we find ourselves in, and that we ourselves have to guard against. I mean, sometimes, just being honest, I don't want to have to hear something that grates on what I think might be true or is off, or that I didn't do right. I can recognize that that's hard to do, and it's made harder when you start hearing rhetoric about how being well-read or knowing what's going on in the broader world is not only not important, but not even desirable.
Right, and the anti-intellectualism that we see increasingly in society is very frightening.
Yeah, it's very frightening.
Because that can impact truth. When I lived in Jerusalem for a year in 1982, it was very clear. Steve, you can bring those up here. it was very clear about, you knew what the bias was of the various news source, and you say, if I want a right-wing news source, I'll go to, the Jerusalem Post. If I want a left-wing news source, I'll go to Haaretz. Or if I want, and I knew that, but if I was just walking up off the street, I wouldn't know that. And we're seeing that increasingly in America more and more. So,
That's a big stack.
It is. All right, so here's one. In what ways do you think that, I was going to ask this one too, so I'll ask it, it's already here. In what ways do you think the Denver Post will be different in 5 and then in 10 years? I mean, so much has changed in the last 4 years.
I mean, we don't actively talk about this, but, so I'm not saying we're doing this. I'm just imagining here. I just want to be really clear about this. But a lot of papers are not printing 7 days a week anymore. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Expense, the carriers got to go out, and one carrier, they have to work 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's not much of a job. And they've rethought what they do with the papers that they do print. We've opposed that for a couple reasons. The thinking being, one, if there's no newspaper, people don't need a newspaper on Monday. Do they think they need one on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, that there's a slope there? And also, we print so many papers at the Post, at our printing plant, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Aurora Sentinel, no, not Aurora anymore, but Aspen Papers, the Gazette, that we're running all the time anyway. But that is one main way that could be changing. I think that the way we handle opinion coverage is going to change quite a bit.
Opinion coverage, yeah.
Yeah,
Talk about
opinion news. And it touches on what we were talking about a minute ago about biased news sources. And in this era, when so many people don't get a newspaper at home, there's just a lot more confusion about what is news and what is opinion. A lot of confusion. And I'll get people who'll say, like, you're supposed to be, why are you so biased? And they'll haul up a story that was written by, it'll be an opinion piece by our editorial page or Doug Friednash or whoever it might be who's writing for us, and they'll be angry that it expressed an opinion and just don't understand that we have two parts of the newsroom, right? Or two parts of our operation, the news and opinion. And I know that this is something we are discussing a lot right now.
Sure.
Is whether we should even do, for example, endorsements. Endorsements have been a part of newspaper coverage forever, but it does confuse people about what your role is in your community. And so do they make sense moving forward? Things like that.
Yeah, but I think, yes, I would hope you do continue to do endorsements. I think it helps clarify, whether there's, I'm going to use the word unbiased because I think it's important. I mean, I know that as a rabbi, I will get criticized that I'm not doing enough on this or I'm doing too much about this, which means that I'm doing my job. Mm-hmm. And so I would say the same thing to the press, that if they say that the Denver Post is too left or too right, you're doing your job. So,
there you go.
Here's this, Sarah, I don't know if you can, well, I'll ask the question. Many news organizations, even those considered to have liberal bias, are owned by billionaires or large corporations that often lean conservative or have an active interest in preserving the status quo. How do the Denver Post and news organizations in general balance the journalistic mission with ownership, financial, and political goals?
Yeah, that would include us. We're owned by Alden Global Capital, which is a hedge fund. And I've had dinner with them, and no, I can say with complete certainty, they lean further right than most of the staff of the Denver Post, and certainly than the Denver Post editorial position. Mm-hmm. So the owners, our owners though, and I think this is true of most, but not all, what they want you to do is be a successful business. And so our owners, at least, that's where they come down. They want us to be a successful business, and they just step out of the news. We don't have an issue with them getting involved in the news. They might they might involve themselves on things like endorsements, like that would be the kind of thing they might say, but not who we endorse, just should we at all, but not who. They don't get involved at that level. Gannett is public, so they answer to a very large situation. And then you have the billionaire owners, I think, where it's one single person owning the newspaper. That's where you most often hear that's where you are most apt to hear the problem that was described in that question, where one owner, like
Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah, right. Where they have, and they may have actual business interests, or it could happen in a community, right, where you have one person owns a local newspaper,
Sure.
and they want to write about something, and it is it just runs counter to that person's interest. That's where you do hear it, and people have quit their jobs over that. Many people have quit their jobs when that happens.
I'm sure. The Atlantic just published an article about the power of Russian trolls impacting what people hear on the left and the right. What have you seen in this regard, and what can be done about this? Is the Post impacted by that?
That goes a little outside my expertise and local. Like, I mean, I've seen it. My knowledge, though, tends to be what I've read, because they tend to try to operate at a more national level. They're not that interested in the Denver's mayor's race.
Yeah,
so,
you never know. I don't know.
You don't know. They could get there.
Here's a good one. In your opinion, what story has the Denver Post carried that has had the greatest impact on our community?
Well, no,
of course, okay. Which is your favorite child? Yes, I know that.
Yes,
You're right.
I know, right? Boy, that is really tough. I think, I don't know if I can pick a favorite child in that. And you can't always see exactly where the impact's going to be. I will tell you that one that comes immediately to mind, and maybe it's because I edited it and was deeply involved, was a project we did around children where the families had contact with human services, and then the children ended up dead some short time afterwards. And we did it in partnership with Channel 9, and it changed laws, and it changed policies, and it changed them fast. And I think, when you see that kind of thing happening, it's why you slog through the business, even through staff reductions and public sentiment that runs against you and hateful phone calls and all that. You stick with it for those days.
There's a question that you're sort of addressing. It's what motivates you to do this work, given all of the frustrations and difficulties that I know that the Post used to be a thicker paper. Now it's...
I know, it's blown off my porch before, I understand. Yeah. I had a lady, so yesterday we had a mistake in the paper. It was a production mistake. And a whole page didn't appear.
Oh.
I know, and it had the advice columns on it.
Oh, no.
And comics. So
oh, no.
I had hundreds of phone calls, me personally, and let alone, the paper as a whole. And some of them were kind of mean. But one of the ladies called back today, and she goes, "I'm sorry that I was so caustic."
Yom Kippur.
Yeah, exactly. And she said, "I just want to say I love the Denver Post. I need the Denver Post, and I depend on the Denver Post." I almost cried. But it is sort of that piece where you know that in ways big and small, that you can help people see something a little bit differently, help them think about something a little bit differently. We did stories about metro districts and the way that people were getting trapped in these house payments that they couldn't afford because they didn't understand how metro districts worked. And we heard from so many people who said, I was about to do this and I stopped. Thanks to you, I didn't get stuck in a house I couldn't afford, things like that. And those just totally make up for the other stuff. Like it does in any profession, right, where it's hard sometimes.
As a woman with a big job in media, do you see the role of women improving or evolving? And then the second part is, do you see the Supreme Court's action, recent actions, I'm assuming about abortion rights, as a threat?
It's been a bit of a surprise to me, given it's 2022. Some of the preconceived notions that you still run into. I'm the first woman to be editor of the Post, and which was surprising in and of itself, given how long we've been around. But I still get people who just don't believe it, who say, no, I want to talk to the real editor, that kind of stuff. So you still get some of that, and name calling and those sorts of things. But I think that as in all sorts of institutions, newspapers, religious institutions, as women have solidified their space, I can see it. I can see a difference in the way we make news judgment. It does impact our news judgment to have more women in the room, as opposed to, it wasn't an exaggeration when I said before, when I started, there were no women in the room making the decisions. There were none. And that you would get talked over, all the things that you hear, trying to get a voice and start to talk, and 3 people interrupt you. And even though I'm talking nonstop now, usually in that situation, I back off. See? Yeah. So I think you do see, you see that making a difference in all sorts of public policy, and in story choices and in who we profile. As for Roe v. Wade, the individual decisions and any other decisions that might come up like that, it's alarming to a huge percent of not just women, but men too. But at the same time, you see how the Colorado legislature reacted, and you see sort of people saying, that happened, why did that happen, where do we go next, what's the path forward? And again, a place where media can play a role is helping to show people how to move forward. So I guess that's the best I can
That's a great
think
answer.
on that.
Thank you. So since it is Yom Kippur, where do you think the media is falling short or missing the mark?
I think, we have to do soul searching. We certainly do. I think, as I had alluded to earlier, I do think that we tend to be in our own bubble too much. You could make a pretty good argument, if just to give a concrete example, would be the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Okay.
And that broke in the New York Post. Nobody else could replicate it. And so it was just sort of like, there's nothing to see here, sort of thing. And Time is not really exactly saying that was quite the right, approach, but I do think you saw some unwillingness to say, maybe we should look a little deeper here or there, and there's bound. I use that just because it hits the mainstream media harder than most. We also, and this isn't getting easier for us as journalism becomes a less attractive field for some people to enter, but we have to guard carefully against hiring a bunch of people who are just like ourselves. And bringing diversity into your newsroom, not just, racial diversity for sure, gender diversity, but thought diversity as well, so that you have somebody when you're making a story choice says, well, wait a minute, what about this? Or when you write a headline that isn't quite precise, someone with a different political view to go, hey, look what you just did there, and you go, oh, good point, I didn't see that because I am who I am, I think how I think, and I just didn't catch that headline or that story play wasn't quite right. And so we have to be careful to guard against that. It's one of our biggest blind spots, I think.
Wow, great. As we get back to truth here, the opposite of truth. I don't know what the opposite of truth is. Let's say it's lies for now. But please explain the process involved in making the decision to correct allegations about the, quote, big lie. Why not do that for other prevalent lies when made for political purposes? I'm not sure the second part of that question.
I'm following it. I don't have big, I follow along because you hear it a lot. Like, so an example the other day was a story about that young man, Elijah McClain, who died in Aurora with the ketamine overdose. Right. And I can't remember what story we were writing, but we said he died of a ketamine overdose. And there was a fair amount of pushback that said, why are you not just saying what happened? Say, he was killed by first responders, which is really a strong way to put, I mean, they did inject, but that sort of gets to where sometimes that goes, is like, how are you going to phrase it, and gets more directly to what really happened, and sort of our effort to balance careful word choice without being so careful you misrepresent things. You see it with January 6th. Was that an insurrection or was it a riot? And there are people who say, you've got to always call it an insurrection. Do not call it a riot. It was an insurrection. Well, I think it probably was it had insurrection-like qualities for sure. But you start using those words that to some people are so clearly what really happened. And it's part of our job sometimes to just step back and go, we just want to be careful here. And we are very careful with saying people lied. Like I don't do it. I hope we never do it. Because that is a suggestion of looking into somebody's intent and their heart, and I'm not a fan of that. I mean, people refer to the big lie. We all know what that is. But to say Donald Trump lied in this case, I'm not a fan of that.
For what reason? You think it's too incendiary, or?
I think that you start down that path, that it gets close to name calling. I don't name call. We don't call people liars. We don't call people names. And I just, it might seem like he lied, or it might seem like this other person lied, but maybe they have some sort of mental, there could be other things. I'm just not ready to ascribe such a vile thing to people without being, I'm not going to do it casually, that's for sure.
Yeah, I bet not. What is the responsibility of the public in keeping the truth in the forefront of the news?
The public, and you know, we've been kind of covered some of this, right? But part of it is to make sure that what you're reading is sufficiently broad, or listening to, is sufficiently broad that you're hearing ideas that maybe rub you a little bit wrong sometimes. Because sometimes, you know, ultimately you'll realize that might be the right way of thinking. There might be something to it. So the public, especially when there's so much news that is, when you can self-select your news so much and pick and choose, and without getting sort of a curated front page like we would produce that would kind of force a mix of ideas out there, force them right in front of your eyes. When you're not getting your news that way, then your responsibility is to curate your own news diet, so it has a little something of everything. That's a big part of what I think the public's responsibility is.
So we shouldn't just watch MSNBC or Fox News. We should also try and switch back and see what everyone is saying.
Yeah.
This is going to be my last question, so that is a cue to those who know what I'm talking about. What are in Jewish tradition, we just celebrated the New Year. So what are your hopes for the new year?
For the Post? For news? All right. My hope, and I'm going to have a staff meeting. Hey, you get an advanced view of my staff meeting that's coming up.
Great. This is being broadcast. You should know that, so they may.
That's all right. It's not that secret.
Okay.
No, I think we at the Post, I would like to see a dream a little bit bigger sometimes. Like, we're working from home now, and it is easy for us, as it is for so many people, to fall into our habit of, then I did this, then I'm going to call this person, I got to go to this meeting, got this court thing I got to do. And I want everybody on our staff to step back and in the next year do something really magnificent, something that, as I told them, as I'm telling them, it could be something hugely important to this community, or it could be hugely important to them. Something that is just a thing that is in their mind and that they just feel like, I want to write this story, I want to tell this story, and I just need a little more time to do it. And we're going to be asking people to all come forth with those ideas, with our commitment being we'll find you the time so that you can do this thing that speaks to you and hopefully does good out in the community too.
Wonderful. Do you think that you'll ever get back into the newsroom?
People can come back, but all the time, every time we try, somebody gets COVID, gives it to somebody, you know, and then, and people, it works for their lives to be home some of the time. So there's certainly people in there any given day. There's maybe 10 or 12, a few people, a handful. And we try to do events together, but I don't think that they want to, and I'm not going to force them.
There you go. Leanne Colachiapo, thank you so very much for gracing our Bima, our Yom Kippur afternoon. Truth is a very, very valuable commodity, and it is essential for all of us. And I really admire you and want to thank you for helping us get a better understanding of what the truth is.
Thank you so much for having me.
My honor. You're welcome anytime.